In this three-part video series, I'm going to teach you how to read one of the most abused books of the Bible. That's right, one of the books that I believe is the most abused, neglected, and often read as a textbook. I'm going to teach you and give you the tools on how to read the book of Genesis. You see, whenever we can approach Genesis, not as a textbook or of code of conducts or rules, or a book just full of rules and stories that are weird and outdated, and we view it as a story that has characters and a plot development, a story of twists and turns and mistakes and accomplishments. We read Genesis in a new light. It's fresh, it's innovative, it has a new depth to it. And so in this series, I'm going to give you 3 tools on how to read the book of Genesis so you can go to it with fresh eyes, not your eyes, but ancient eyes. Hey everybody, my name is Peyton Mensmeyer, and I want to help you fall back in love with your Bible, with your faith, and with Jesus. And I do that through writing, through blogs on my website, PeytonMensmeyer.com. I also do that through making videos like this, where I take the content from my blogs and I try to help it come alive. I try to help those who are more visual or like to hear my beautiful voice or whatever it might be. So I make these videos to help you. If you could, just go to PeytonMensmeyer.com. There you can subscribe to my emails. You will get all of the new blogs that I put out on a weekly basis. And if you could also go to YouTube, there you can find all of these videos. And if you want to subscribe there, I won't be hurt by that, and you can be updated every time one of these new videos comes out. And you're going to want to do that because we have 2 more videos coming up after this as second parts 1, 2, and 3 of how to read Genesis, how to read one of the most abused books of the Bible. So let's get into the book of Genesis. You see, there are 2 misreadings when it comes to the book of Genesis. There's 2 ways that people approach Genesis that I believe are damaging and abusive to a book that was written to an Israelite nation with an Israelite audience in mind. So the 2 abuses that we often come to the Genesis are, number 1, is we often try to read Genesis as a textbook. Now, I want you to hear me clearly. This is not me claiming that the stories and the events that happen in Genesis are not true, okay? That they're not factual, that they're not historical. I am not making that claim, nor am I denying that claim, okay? I'm not. That's not what this is about. Because I don't think Genesis, or the author of Genesis, had that in mind either, right? Whenever he's writing these stories, or she is writing these stories, they're not doing it so that in the 21st century we can look back and know exactly what happened and in the order that they happened and how God was working with his people historically, right? When it comes to science, when it comes to history, right? The author doesn't have that in mind. He has something bigger in mind. So we have to stop approaching Genesis looking for history, looking for facts, looking of how man was made, and arguments against evolution and the timeline, and if Noah really had an ark and there really was a flood. See, when we approach the text in that kind of mentality, with those kind of questions, we're automatically abusing the purpose and the beauty of the text. So stop reading it as a textbook. And second, stop reading it as a book of principles. And again, let me give my disclaimer. This is not me claiming that the book of Genesis does not have something to offer us today. I think it does. I think it has a beautiful portrait of the human condition and the human heart and God and our relationship with each other, and that struggle, that wrestling, as we see with Jacob, that wrestling that we have with God. I think there's a lot of depth and truth that applies across all generations. But when we try to go to Genesis, just siphoning out truths and little nuggets and little principles that we can carry home with us, we abuse it. We're tearing apart, we're dissecting the story and trying to pause at every scene to reflect, okay, what does this mean to me? It's like if you watch The Avengers or This Is Us, and you stopped every 5 minutes trying to dissect, okay, what does this scene mean to me, right? And when you do that, you break up the story. You completely lose the overarching meaning and what the author is trying to portray, right? And so in Genesis, we have to stop doing the same thing. We need to read the story as a collection, as a whole, and look at the story in its entirety and find out what that means, not only to me, but to the human, right? To humankind, to our condition, and where we're starting to see patterns in context and so on and so forth. So those are two major ways to stop abusing the Bible, and we're going to break down 3 tools in these next three videos to help you, tools that you can use to help you read the book of Genesis. And I know the past couple of minutes of this video have already begun shaking your foundation of faith. It's okay, right? I know that feeling. I know the feeling of my faith feeling like it's crumbling beneath me, like everything I've ever known and ever learned is not true, that I've been lied to. Don't feel that way, okay? That's not what this video is about, and I promise you can walk away from this feeling even more in love with your Bible. Just stick with me, okay? Because while there's a lot of baggage that we have built onto the text, we're going to slowly unfamiliarize ourselves with these stories and try to fall back in love with what the author had in mind for us. So over the next 3 videos, we're going to give you 3 tools that you can take to Genesis to help you read it better. We're going to show you context and the importance of knowing the context of the story. We're going to break down how to pick up patterns in the Genesis story and how those patterns serve as hyperlinks that are all connected with each other. And then we're going to break down meaning and trying to discover what actual meaning looks like in the book of Genesis. And with these 3 things, with context, with patterns, with meaning, we can equip ourselves, we can begin to equip ourselves on how to read the book of Genesis correctly and how I believe it was intended to be read. So let's start with the very first one, and that is context. So I'm sorry and my bad mean basically the same thing, don't they? Unless you are at a funeral, right? So context matters. It always matters. In all of our circumstances, context matters. And context is directing the audience to a specific moment, a specific time, a specific place, a specific thing that's surrounding a situation, right? It's trying to direct the readers to a certain mindset by establishing the context. You know this, right? If you read a book or if you watch a movie, right? They spend the first 10 minutes or 2 chapters establishing the context of the story. So they build the world and then they fill the world with characters and plot lines and problems so that you can be living in that world for a moment. Well, the same is true in Genesis, okay? So it's important not for us to read it with our eyes, with our lens, in our context, but putting it thousands of years ago to when it was read, written, and experienced. Okay, so if you're going to understand the context of Genesis, you need to know who lives north of Genesis. Who lives north of the Israelites, right? The Canaanites. Now, who are the Canaanites? Well, you might not know if you're not very familiar with your Bible, but if you are, even faintly, you know that the Canaanites are the enemy, the arch nemesis of the Israelites. They hate the Canaanites. They hate everything about them. In fact, the Canaanites had them as captives at one point, right? And probably by the time this was written, they were coming out of captivity of these foreign nations. They hate the Canaanites. So what does that have to do with Genesis? Well, it has everything to do with Genesis. And it actually goes all the way back to the very beginning, the creation story. We see a jab at the Canaanites. So whenever you can read Genesis within its context, stories like this become a lot more interesting. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, it says, "So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the water swarms." Were you aware before now that there were sea creatures in your Bible? No, I'm not kidding. This is not some Harry Potter book, or I didn't take this. This is in your Bible, right? Sea creatures is in your Bible. So what am I supposed to read, right? And before, you might have just read this as, okay, they're just big fish or the Loch Ness Monster or whatever, right? God is creating sea creatures. But whenever you can read this in the Hebrew, okay, which as an English reader, we're already at a disadvantage, so I'm going to help you there. Whenever we can read this in its original Hebrew and we know the context by which it's told, man, that word means everything. So let's do a little Hebrew lesson here. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I didn't sign up to take Hebrew, snoozeville. I don't want to learn Hebrew. But I promise you, as I always do, that when you can build the backdrop, right, it will pay off. It brings the Bible to life, and we're going to set it back within its context. So the word for sea creatures there, okay? Sea creatures in your Bible, or whatever it has, big fish, or whatever your Bible says, is a Hebrew word, tananim. Now, if you're a Hebrew scholar, I probably butchered that. Don't worry about it. Just stick with me here, okay? Tananim, or tananin, probably doesn't mean anything to you, but to the Hebrew, it meant everything. I mean, absolutely everything, because of their neighbors up north, their enemies up north. Did you know that Tananim, or Tananin, is actually a Canaanite god? Right. It is. It's one of their many gods. They're polytheists, so they believe that there are multiple gods that control the universe. Israel is the opposite. They think there's not multiple gods. There is one single monotheistic God. In fact, our God is the God over the gods. He is the Elohim of the Elohim, right? The God of gods, right? Do you see what is happening here? Okay, so the Israelites, or the author of Genesis at least, is claiming in the very beginning of the book, right, that our God, our Yahweh, our monotheistic God, our single God, is not only the creator of the universe, of everything that you can see in front of you as we see, but he is the creator of your gods, right? Your God is so insignificant and our God is so powerful that we are claiming that our God created your gods, right? And even more significant is Tananim, right, in the Canaanite ideology, is the god of chaos. Now, when did we recently hear, if we're at the beginning of Genesis, when did we recently hear about our God putting order to chaos, right? At the very beginning, right? The watery depths, and God puts order to the waters. He ceases them, he builds land, he fills it, right? Our God has order over chaos. Our God has power over your supposed gods, right? There is an incomprehensible depth to the Bible whenever we put it back in its context, something that you would have never have seen in a million years, right? All of a sudden, the story of Genesis becomes so much more alive because we put it back in its context. We take it out of our context, right? The 21st century, we say, okay, you don't belong there. You belong in this ancient mindset with these ancient eyes, with these ancient neighbors, in this ancient mind, and I'm going to try to read it in that lens, with that lens, and all of a sudden the Bible becomes so much more alive to us. And that's what I want to help you see. Right? And that's how we slowly unabuse the book of Genesis. When we learn to read it correctly, right? That maybe this isn't necessarily a story trying to tell us about how creation actually happened historically, though it could be, right? But maybe there is more happening here. Maybe this is a smite, right? Maybe this is Israel looking at their enemies saying, hey, guess what? Our God created your God. What's up, right? And this is political. This is weighted. This is a claim of who Yahweh is. And I think it has so much to speak to us as well. Of that same God, the same God that has the power over these other gods in the Israelites' mind, that same God is alive today. That God never changes. His power has not faded over time, right? And we, as the Israelites do, sometimes we need to review God as a God who has power in the world, a God who can bring order to chaos, a God who is powerful enough to create everything, even these seemingly other gods in our life. And when we can read it through that lens, our God becomes so much more powerful, and the Bible, in the book of Genesis, becomes also more relevant to our life. Thanks for joining us in this video on how to read one of the most abused books of the Bible. And this week we talked about context. Next week we're going to talk about patterns. And what patterns are, or one way that I like to explain what patterns are, is they're like ancient hyperlinks in your Bible, right? It's like you're reading along and you come to one of those shining, bright, neon blue buttons as you're reading, and as an ancient Israelite reading it, you can click on it and it's taking you back to something else, to some other story. It's trying to connect these two stories to have an even deeper meaning, okay? And they're riddled throughout your Bible. They're all over the place, but as modern readers, we often lose sight of them. They get lost in translation or whatever it might be. But whenever we can re-equip ourselves with how to pick up patterns and how to read patterns, the Bible becomes so much more alive and connected, right? And there's connections all over the place within Genesis, within the rest of the book of the Old Testament, and even pointing us all the way to the New Testament, to Jesus and what he did in the world. So make sure you go and watch the next video, part 2 of how to read the most abused book of the Bible. I'm Peyton Mensmeyer, and I'm trying to help you fall back in love with your Bible, with your faith, and with Jesus. You can find all of my blogs, including this one, at PeytonMensmeyer.com. Go there, go subscribe, be filled in. Every time a new blog comes out, I put a new thing out weekly. Maybe it's something I'm reading or something I'm watching. I try to write about it, and I try to spin it in such a way to help you fall back in love with this rich history that we as Christians have. You can also go to YouTube. There you can also subscribe. I know you're subscribing to a lot of things, but it's really going to help connect everything that I'm doing. There you'll find all of these videos and more. It's all at PeytonMensmeyer.com or Peyton Mensmeyer on YouTube. Subscribe to both of those and be filled in and updated every time something new comes out. Again, I want to help you fall back in love with your Bible, with your faith, and with Jesus. And we do that one video, one blog, and one verse at a time. We'll see you on the next one.